maybe this will help. You have a peer-reviewed meta-analysis saying that beliefs inform actions.
Stop. That is a bomb. That is a, boom, there's the game. I've come with the evidence supporting exactly what I'm saying that you're asking for. Here it is. This needs a spotlight.
You're saying he wasn't making that point?
No, what he did is he made the point, you called him out on it, and he said, I'm not accusing you of making that point. Nah, dude, you're the one who made the point, not me. If you would have,
what he said?
Yes.
First of all, I'm not saying you're making that argument. And
oh my God.
So
what's up, skeptics? Thomas Westbrook and Eric Murphy here.
Hey.
Earlier this month, I had a debate with Michael Jones of the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy at DebateCon, and I wanted to take a little bit of time with Eric to go over that debate because it was my first in-person debate. Eric has a lot more experience than I do, and I wanted to go through and look. You helped me prep for the debate.
I did.
And I wanted to maybe see what your feedback is. And
absolutely, man.
Hopefully I didn't botch it completely.
We're going to go through it pieces at a time. There are a couple of places that I really kind of wanted to bring up and talk to you about. I think overall you did good, and I want to kind of go through a couple of those things. So when you're ready.
So the first thing that I want to get feedback on is my opening statement. And I don't want to go through the whole thing. The video's up. People can go and watch it. I'll link to it below.
Yeah.
But I laid out, a definition for Christianity because the question was, is Christianity dangerous?
Right.
I eliminated a bunch of things that he, I kind of anticipated that he was going to not argue about Christianity, but maybe religion in general, or maybe that it's beneficial rather than actually looking at danger. So I emphasize what the debate was, and then I got into how do we determine if something is dangerous.
Right.
And the scale that I gave, I'll just play this clip. Well, first we have to determine how we figure out if something is or isn't dangerous. Fortunately for us, neither Michael nor I have to create our own standard. The United States government is constantly in the business of risk assessment, and as an authority on the topic has developed a very clear 3-step process of assessing risk. Step 1, you identify the hazard. This could be something like a fire, a tornado, terrorism, a cyber attack, a pandemic, etc. You look at the probability and magnitude of the effect. Has this happened before? What's the likelihood of it happening again? Here's where I think that this method, it works, but there's an area in between there where, so you have 3 steps.
Right.
And it's, identify the hazard, you do a vulnerability assessment, and you look at the impact. But there's in between that, there's like a little arrow that says, what's the probability of this happening? What's the probability and magnitude? And I glossed over that.
Yep.
But I think that that's the area where the debate suffered on later, because there's stuff that it's like, it doesn't have to be 100% probability. It doesn't have to be 100% of Christians. It doesn't even have to be 50%. If you have a sizable minority that are causing harm and the massive majority is silent or is not effective at preventing this harm, then you can still have an incredible danger.
Sure, absolutely. So that is absolutely something that I agree when I was watching this. The things that I was looking for in this intro was defining your terms, establishing a test, that's reliable, that's not biased, that you can use to assess danger, and application of that test. And so that middle piece of here is the test, here's why it's important. I think in the future, if you were to do this kind of thing again, I would try and run that entire intro through the lens of that test and keep reiterating over and over again, as you're giving examples. That way, when the audience moves forward, they don't take that as, oh, this is supporting evidence of another thing. No, this is the test. And here are the parts that are important. But I think that overall, the slide, the test that you chose, and the way that you talked about it is fantastic. I just wanted more.
And that's where I suffered by taking too long at the beginning, because towards the end, I actually did have this same test used 3 times, where it was like initially I was talking about, faith healing and divine protection. And so I talk about how, faith healing is harmful using this test and the ramifications of it. I talked about people who think that they have divine protection from God and how that's harmful. And then I got into like the ostracism and denigration, demonization of non-religious and ex-Christians and non-believers and the harm that causes to things like mental health, which when later he starts arguing about how like people who are religious have better mental health. I
want to talk about that. We're going to get there. We're going to get there.
But when I was those examples that I really wanted to get to, and then the third one was how Christianity treats the LGBT community, because I didn't want to go like back hundreds of years to like the Crusade and the Inquisition and start gish galloping with like the Salem witch trials and all this stuff. And he was like, yeah, but that's like we're looking at Christianity today. And those were misinterpretations. I didn't want to get into the weeds of like hermeneutics and dissecting Bible verses and what do they really mean. I wanted to look at right now in the 21st century, what are some really salient examples that people understand and relate to that a lot of Christians are interpreting a particular way and the harm that it's causing.
I entirely agree. And if you were to give it that time, the only advice that I would want to coach you on and really make sure that you're doing is when you started giving those examples, even if you had enough time, it came off as a different point that was not related to the test that you're talking about. And because of that, instead of it supporting the test, it just became another thing in contention for, the audience's memory. And so I would bring up the test again and take the example, put it in the test.
That's what my slides in my PowerPoint.
Oh no, really?
The slides at the very end. Oh. It basically, I took this test and I plugged things into the first, second, and third section, which I do once. I do once towards the end of my opening statement. But then I had the next one, here's Bible verses that people are reading to interpret this.
I saw that.
Here's the thing that they're interpreting. Here's the harm and the likelihood and probability of it happening. And here's the ramifications and stuff. And I was plugging it in. And then I did that with the bigotry towards the LGBT as well. And so I had examples that are all plugging into this test and showing and reiterating and bringing the point home.
Here's the test.
And I ran out of time. I believe, am I at time? Now I have example after example after example. Unfortunately, I've ran out of time, so I have to leave it there.
Yeah.
And so then people are like, the only example that you really gave was like faith healing. And I was like, you're right.
Ran out. Yeah. So, and even if you have less time, really making sure that your key things are what you're saying, and then you're repeating those throughout. Even if you run out of time, what you've done up until that point is you're just reiterating the important stuff, and you're not worried about not having set the stage yet. You know what I mean? So yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. That said, you were very prepared. You did prepare very well as far as, what you wanted to get through on your opening, and the fact that you didn't get to it, I wouldn't stress that much about it. My very first debate, I got some really bad advice. I was told not to prepare or study and just go off the cuff. And it was terrible.
Uh-oh.
It was much worse. And so I'm sitting back, and I mean, I'm in a position where I have, discussions and debate with people very, very often now. But I got to tell you, especially on a stage like that, you should be a lot easier on yourself. You did better on this than I did in my first, for sure.
Well, my initial reaction, to be fair, was when I was asked, do you want to debate on the topic of, is Christianity dangerous? My initial reaction was, I can think of 100 examples of how Christianity is dangerous and areas where it has led to harm. But I am so glad that I didn't just go off the cuff and that I researched it, because when I watched the debates that Michael Shermer did with IP on this topic, that
Vegan Gains
did, that Arn Ra did, I got to see his presentation, Inspiring Philosophies, and I think if I had gone with that approach, my initial approach, I would have been completely in over my head, and because he was intentionally crafting his opening statement in order to kind of head that off before I could even get to it.
Yeah, it had making sure that you have direction and that what you're talking about leads to a point, because I've seen lots of debates that have just kind of floundered, and not because the people weren't passionate, not because they weren't knowledgeable, but because they were not really illustrating something that the audience could follow. And a lot of that is kind of the theater of debate. You go to a debate because you want to experience those things. And if you're not curating that experience to, develop those ideas in a structured way, people are going to flounder. So I absolutely agree.
Well, and it's like, even if you have the knowledge up here, if you're not able to present it in a way that's digestible,
we're going to talk about
people's eyes glaze over and just like...
So you did that a few times very well, and you did that a few times not very well, and we're going to talk about that today.
All right. There's another point where I think that practice would have helped a little bit, and it was with technical hiccups, because I ended up in this situation where I was doing the PowerPoint, but I had a statement to read off, and I didn't really think about it ahead of time, that if I'm going to have a statement that's on my computer and I'm running the PowerPoint from my computer, I need to have something to read it off on.
Yeah.
So what I have, I don't know if you can see at the top, I have a tablet over my screen, which means I can't see my PowerPoint or what's on it while I'm reading.
I didn't even notice.
And the tablet kept timing out and going dark. And so I'd have to turn it back on, sign back in the middle of my debate to keep reading through while trying to read without pauses. And so you got stuff like this. Any clear and present dangers? I need to. All right. Now I need to stress. So like right there, I was signing back into my tablet and I was on the wrong slide because I couldn't see it because my tablet was covering it.
So that's totally okay.
How do you print off a paper copy of what you want to read off?
So I have seen debates where people will just pull out their written statement and read it like this and just go entirely off of it.
Yeah, but that's not engaging.
No, it's not. And it's keeping in mind, though, what people are used to, what they see during debates. When that kind of thing happens, instead of trying to hide it or hope that it doesn't happen, if it happens, hang a lantern on it and be like, oh, it just signed out. Well, here we go. You can depend on an audience to be empathetic that way. And so if something like that happens, it doesn't necessarily mean that you made a mistake. And it doesn't mean, because you're not going to be able to prepare for everything all of the time like that.
But acknowledge technical flukes rather than making it look like I'm bumbling.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Acknowledge it and go, oh, hey, here's a technical fluke. Okay, and let's keep going.
Cool.
That way, it doesn't seem like you're trying to hide anything. You aren't, if there's a technical fluke, that doesn't mean that you are losing in debate. It just means that there's a technical issue. It happens. All right, what's the next clip?
So the next thing that I wanted to get to was, he has a bunch of slides that he has used in debates, and he's used them in multiple debates that he's had on this topic, and he uses a lot of the same slides, but then he threw in some new studies to kind of throw me off. But I'd actually, because I had done my research and I'd seen his presentation, I had pre-printed all of the studies that he had brought, and I had examples kind of ready to go. But there's this one slide that I didn't address, and I wanted to, and I didn't have time to get to it. But I want to take a quick second and just look at it right now.
Sure.
To show Christianity is dangerous or causes harm, you have to need to find a place in the Bible where you think there's a negative quality taught, then show this verse actually means how you interpret it. Most Christians agree this is how to properly interpret that, and then show evidence this belief results in horrible effects in society and individuals.
There's a couple of big issues that I have with his process, and why I went with a very different process. And I should have emphasized my process stronger. He didn't keep coming back to this, and so I didn't.
To be fair, he did not back this process up either. And so because of that, I can guarantee you that a lot of audience members were not able to apply his test either.
That's true.
And so even if he was doing something to support one of those pieces of his test, it wasn't if he really wanted to apply this, he needed to reiterate throughout, here is the test, here's why it's important. And then in his examples, he would say, okay, here's where it fits into the first part of the test, here's where it fits in the second, here's where it fits in the third. And it can sound, especially when you're practicing and on paper, it may seem redundant, but that's part of the presentation of a good debate.
There's repetition and bringing it home.
You got it.
Yeah, because he at the very beginning he said, you have to say that your interpretation is the correct one. And I'm like, no, my interpretation is completely irrelevant. it doesn't matter. And I said that at one point in the debate, where it's like, it doesn't matter how I interpret it or how Michael interprets a particular Bible verse. What matters is, are there enough Christians that are interpreting it in a negative, harmful way? Because if you have a book that is so easily interpreted in this negative way, whether or not it's the right way to interpret it or not, it's so rife for this harmful interpretation.
Agreed.
And people believe that that's the interpretation, and beliefs inform actions.
Yeah, I entirely agree. I think that people often mistake less dangerous with correct. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, there's the entire field of hermeneutics dedicated to trying to understand what people meant when they said a certain thing in history. And so when you get that, in his example, he says Bible verse says X, people interpret it to mean Y. If you don't have access to X that way, which we don't, that's why hermeneutics exists, then saying, well, it's not really X, you're just misinterpreting it. No, you may just have a less dangerous interpretation, but you don't have it right. Yeah. All you got to do is say, hey, could you be wrong? Well, yeah, you could be, which is why they're all interpretations.
The fact that biblical experts, hundreds of biblical experts have come up with dozens of different translations that are all a little bit different from each other, and that none of them have the original manuscripts. Yeah. That the original manuscripts, or the oldest manuscripts that we have, are written hundreds of years after, especially in the case of the Old Testament, after the stories that are being told. And they're translations, and sometimes translations of translations, and copies of copies of copies of copies. And so it's like, if you have this, and then you're translating it into a new language like English, and you're trying to take all of these, linguistic oddities and make sense of them, and sometimes there's multiple ways, multiple meanings, and there's no consensus on what is, a metaphor and what is...
No, and even if you were a Christian who is trying their absolute best, right? If anybody has seen Strong's Concordance, it's this giant book that's supposed to help you understand original language as you're reading through the Bible. But speaking to scholars about Strong's Concordance, they hate it because it just does not give the context necessary to understand the language truly. And so if you were a Bible-believing Christian who is trying to look for and internalize this belief system, and you go so far as to buy this giant book just so that you can understand it in its original language, and even then it doesn't fit, then for somebody to say, oh, you own Strong's Concordance, but you still, came up with a bad conclusion, well, then that's not Christianity. That's your fault. No, that is a no true Scotsman argument. The fact is, you're kind of stuck with all of them.
Well, and if scholars and apologists and pastors are all having that problem, how much more difficult is it for the average person?
Yeah.
And so that's where I would say, if you have a Bible that is so difficult to interpret, if God really understood, and I want to do an entire video on this specific thing called, the problem with misinterpretation or miscommunication. And it's like, if God understands how we think, and he's all powerful and all knowledgeable, you'd think he'd be able to communicate in a way that would be clear and concise and easy to understand for everyone. And instead we get this convoluted mess. And it's dangerous because it has verses that are outright commanding horrible atrocities if you take them even remotely literally.
Mm-hmm. And I agree.
Yeah. And the other thing with this is, he says you have to say that, the Bible says X, and maybe you interpret it to mean Y, and X, and Y is harmful. And I'm like, there's times where you can have multiple interpretations of a verse that are still dangerous. So both X and Y can be bad. And an example of this is, when the Bible condones slavery, and Christians will say, well, it's more like indentured servitude. You just own them for 7 years instead of for their whole life. And it's like, okay, one, that's, not the case. And there's Dr. Josh Bowen has done a really great video and written a book on this topic. But also, both X and Y, both of those things, owning another human being, whether it's for their entire life or for 7 years and taking away their autonomy temporarily, they're still bad.
Agreed. And also, quit pretending like extra biblical explanations are somehow still valid. The example that I think of is the Noah's Ark story. If someone were to say, oh, well, there was a localized flood and that's what, inspired the Noah's Ark story, congratulations. That's great. But the biblical story doesn't say it was a localized flood. It says it covered the earth. And if it covered the earth, either it did or it didn't. And so if you're going to say, oh, well, here's where it comes from, I get it. And I'm glad that you understand that. But that does not validate the verse. It instead replaces the verse with reality.
And then you're having to post hoc go in and say, as you gather new information, well, now we realize that that's all metaphorical. Well, what about for the thousands of years that everyone thought that it was literal because they didn't have all of the understanding of, geology and being able to actually figure out if there was a global flood or not?
Then, using this test, if that was the case, then Christianity is not at fault for any of that, because it's just people's mistake, which is part of why this kind of reasoning cannot be falsified. And we're going to go into that more, but I do kind of want to lay down the reason why this line of reasoning is tough is because it can't be falsified. You can't demonstrate that, but to say that, oh, well, they did something I don't like, therefore their interpretation is wrong, so it's not Christianity's fault, is bogus.
And then the last thing with this is most Christians also interpret X to mean Y. He's saying you have to show that this particular interpretation that's harmful is a majority opinion. And I don't think you have to do that, because I don't think that you have to have, for example, 60% or 55 or even 51% of Christians all going out and stoning gay people. If 1% of Christians were doing that, and you have 3 billion Christians, then you still have millions of Christians going out killing gay people. Yeah. That is horrible. That's a horrific atrocity. Now, I don't think that millions of Christians are going out and gay people, going out and stoning gay people. The stats don't indicate that, but they're certainly shunning them. They're certainly denigrating them. They're ostracizing them, demonizing them, kicking them out of the house. And, that's why the rate of suicide among gay men is 3 times higher in Christian households than not. And that's why the suicide rate with trans people is so high.
It's terrifying. Yeah.
So it's like, you don't have to have, 55%. If you have a sizable minority that is causing damage based off of a book and an interpretation of a book that is so rife for interpretation in that way that literally says that, and they're acting on it and believe it, then that's a problem. That's a danger.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Okay, so the next piece that I want to look at is specifically about intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. It was kind of the crux of what IP was talking about. In fact, I was really, really happy. I feel like if you want to understand this, you need to know about Gordon Allport. And when you brought it up during the debate, actually, can you play that? Do you have the clip?
Mm-hmm. The studies that he looked at dividing religion into intrinsic versus extrinsic, they're using a scale that was developed by Gordon, Allport? Allport.
Yes. Okay. So here's my understanding of Gordon Allport. Gordon Allport, it was a highly respected academic who really advanced the field of and the understanding of prejudice, and specifically kind of, what motivates prejudice and action, racism and things like that. And what he's contributed is wonderful, and I don't want to denigrate that. I want to absolutely go, hey, you know what? Him bringing up different things that influence prejudicial behavior has done a lot, and it is a highly, he is a highly sourced author. That said, his relationship with religion is an interesting one. So I believe it was in 1948, Gordon Allport did a study about racism. And he was looking at, what was it? Church attendance, actually, and saw that there was a positive correlation between church attendance and racism. And so you could dependably look at a population and go, okay, well, it appears that the more a person goes to church, the more likely they are to hold racist views. This is in 1948. And then from there, you get this, oh gosh, okay, that can't work. Okay, well, what do we do about it? Well, there's got to be more to this. And so you have this move towards what would eventually be intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. And so it was first, well, the mature and immature religiosity. And if you separate people out by mature and immature, obviously the mature ones, it gets rid of the racism, and you can find the immature religiosity is where the racism lives. Mind you, at this time, what they did is they would give out questionnaires and use the results of those questionnaires, trusting that people were answering honestly, to get this data. And so once it moved out of that, it took a couple of different steps until it got to internal and external religiosity. Using data that comes from questionnaires is fantastic. You can learn a lot, but there are some things that you just can't do. If somebody says, oh, I go to church for these reasons, you believe them, right? You can't then, after the fact, especially if you disagree with them, go, oh, well, maybe you just had different motivations. No, that's not how that works. You take the data, you plug it in. You don't question whether or not they are lying. And so why is intrinsic and extrinsic? I'm kind of going far afield here, but here's why I want to bring it back. Because intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity are both parts of the exact same coin. It's still religiosity. If you are talking about Christianity, you are talking about all of them. You can try and denigrate, people who have different motivations or look at things differently, but the fact is you're still stuck with all of them. And so he's going to try and make the point that Christianity is necessarily intrinsic, when in fact every single study that goes over intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity understand that the intrinsic and extrinsic are both sides of the same religious coin. And so that is a fundamental misunderstanding of all of the studies that he brings up that day. Mm-hmm. So let's go in and look at his introduction to intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. Now,
extrinsic religiosity is these individuals are religious as a means to an end. They're not motivated by religion. One is religious not because they believe the core tenets of the faith, but because they want to be part of a community, gain social status, or because it's a family tradition. The extrinsic type turns to God, but without turning away from the self. Some qualify as intrinsically religious. These individuals find that their religion is their primary motivator. If one is intrinsically religious, they are religious because they want to hold to the core tenets of a faith. Having embraced the creed, the individual endeavors to internalize and follow it fully.
Okay, so do you kind of see the problem there?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of issues that I see. Is one, he's, rather than talking about specifically Christianity as a whole, mm-hmm. he's now talking about religiosity, and he's dividing it into intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity as two separate things. And then he's narrowing down and focusing just on intrinsic and saying, as long as this aspect, this one part of Christianity is good, that's the only true Christianity, and all of the rest of this is like a no true Scotsman.
And that follows in exactly with, you were raised Christian, I was raised Christian, and this idea of being in the world but not of the world, understanding that worldly outside things are what you should shun and you should be focusing internally, fits that especially religious narrative. And so when you point at things that way to the believer, they're going to look at that and go, oh, well, yeah, of course, if somebody's coming in for, what they would view as inauthentic reasons, then they can be discounted. And that's just not okay. If you want data about that, sure. And you can learn a lot about that. That's fantastic. What you can't do is then go in after the fact and try and discredit people. So what he does later on is he goes, well, somebody needs to understand and accept and internalize the fullness of Christian teachings. Okay. So if someone does something you don't like, could you go, oh, well, your interpretation was wrong, therefore you weren't internalizing the fullness of Christian teachings, so I'm not going to allow you to be part of the intrinsic club. I'm going to now kick you out to the extrinsic club. It essentially sets anyone up to be the moderator and the gatekeeper, and that's not how the data is collected. The data is collected using polls.
Well, I think there's two other things about it that trouble me, and that's that most of the studies that he was looking at, specifically most of the studies that he was looking at that dealt with intrinsic versus extrinsic religiosity, had to do with mental health. And he brings up like 5 or 6 studies later. Mm-hmm. And for each one of those, it's like, yes, if you are saying intrinsic religiosity is, someone who's intrinsically religious is someone who's authentic, then it's like, okay, basically what you're saying is authenticity is correlated with positive mental health.
Well, and also there's a false dichotomy that you bring up beautifully in your nuclear reactor example. Do you have that queued up?
We're not even here to talk about whether or not Christianity has a net positive or negative effect on people's health or well-being. We're debating whether or not it's dangerous. For example, nuclear power has tremendous benefits to society, providing clean energy to millions of people, and has even been used as a power source in outer space missions. But it would be foolhardy to ignore the inherent dangers with nuclear power, and that's why nuclear engineers have created safeguards at every single nuclear reactor currently in use.
Perfect. That example, I think what you did in that intro nipped that in the bud. And so pointing out whether or not something's beneficial doesn't mean that it's necessarily not dangerous. So I think you did a good job there.
And I think that I could have, in response to him saying that, I could have kind of re-emphasized the nuclear power thing. Mm-hmm. Because it's like, yeah, nuclear meltdowns are extremely dangerous, but it's because of those dangers that we put safeguards in and we learn over time to guard against them. And that's actually an area where, like, he specifically asks me at one point, he says,
well, I mean, that's with anything. That's why I talked about hospitals.
So you admit that Christianity is dangerous?
I'm not saying Christianity is dangerous. I'm saying there's dangers that are just, if that's the low bar, hospitals are dangerous. Because you would have to conclude that, hospitals are dangerous because botched surgeries could happen.
I showed a clear-cut case of how Christianity can lead to harmful, dangerous things. And it's not just happening as a one-off. Like, this is happening at scale. And I just want an acknowledging of that. Because as soon as you start saying, well, this other thing can be dangerous and that can be dangerous too, it's like, okay, but at least admit that this is dangerous too.
So are hospitals dangerous to you?
I mean, they can be. There can be aspects of them that are.
See, I feel like we're defining dangerous differently then.
Okay. Thomas, I love you like a brother. What should you have done? Because I know that I'm Monday morning quarterbacking it, but I think that you really missed a big opportunity there.
Yeah, and so here's my thought process. And
okay.
I've seen quite a bit of feedback online where, like, some people have said, when Thomas admitted that by his definition hospitals are dangerous,
he lost
the debate, right? Yeah. And I mean, my pushback to that would be that hospitals historically have been extremely dangerous, right? It's where people have gone and caught infections and all sorts of things, and there's bacteria and there's all sorts of stuff that's why we've learned about sanitation and why doctors wear masks and gloves and keep people isolated and stuff. Like there's all sorts of things that are put in place in order to mitigate those dangers.
Right.
And religion over the centuries has not been willing to acknowledge or self-examine in the same way.
Yeah.
It's been forced to, and it's been dragged kicking and screaming every step of the way, and it's always behind the gun with that stuff.
I agree, and I would go further. If he brought up hospitals, be like, cool, we are going to apply the same standards that we do to hospitals to religion. Because guess what? That's what malpractice insurance is for. Hospitals have amazing insurance policies because bad things happen. People do get hurt. And those insurance policies are only there because you have actuaries who are able to go in and assess the danger and then and provide insurance to match what that danger could be. It recognizes danger and then, you're right, puts those things in place. So has Christianity recognized the danger and then put anything in place? The hospitals, what they don't do, the hospitals don't sit back and go, oh, well, you were already hurt maybe, or, maybe it was something else and it wasn't the doctor. How can you prove? Like, no, they're not going to sit and...
That's what lawyers are for.
Yeah. They don't try and shuffle that off. They recognize their part and they behave like adults and get insurance and do their best to minimize the danger. The worst thing to do is pretend like the danger's not there.
Well, and even if you are going to go, full like big pharma, they're all out just to make money or whatever, like even then it's like, that's why, you have, and it's not always a perfect system, but why we've put in place certain government oversights like, the FDA and stuff that will make drug producers declare what all the dangers are. So when you see like an ad on TV that says, ask your doctor about this, it's like side effects may include yada, 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 yada. And sometimes it's like, and potentially death. And they'll be upfront about it. It might be like in 2% of cases or in 0.0001% of cases. And that might be a risk you're willing to take because the alternative of the sickness is so much more dangerous, but you have to know the dangers, and you have to know if I'm taking this medication, it increases this danger, and if I'm in this particular situation, and if I'm pregnant, it increases this risk.
But if you were to look at those medications and treatments, and they were to never tell you what the dangers are,
that'd be a problem.
Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to get at with this is like, the purpose of this debate was not to say, to do a cost-benefit analysis with Christianity or look at the benefits. Like, I'm willing to have that discussion. But for this debate, it was like, you're not even willing to admit that the dangers are there.
Right.
And he chose the debate topic, and then he's just like, well, in that case, everything's dangerous. It's like, dude, you picked the topic to say it's not dangerous at all.
Yeah, you actually went in and at one point you said, if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, you've already lost this debate. That was very well said. I was happy that you got that point in.
Yeah, but there's an issue with the hospitals thing that I think is even deeper. And I think you had maybe a point you wanted to make on this as well.
Sure.
But it has to do with he made an example to the Pillsbury Doughboy and whether or not it's dangerous. Let's watch that clip.
Sure.
I do want to talk about how you're overall talking about how religiosity, Christian religiosity, people can interpret verses and then do all sorts of horrible things with that. Well, I mean, you could do that with just about anything. I could interpret the Pillsbury Doughboy to telling me that I'm should go out and kill people. That doesn't mean that the company is responsible if a crazy person does that and goes out and kills people.
Okay, so here's the funny thing. If Pillsbury as a company decided to include in the text on the tub of cookie dough that you're going to use, that if a man should lie with another man the way a man lies with a woman, then they should be stoned and that their blood is on their own hands. If that were to happen and you were to interpret it the way that it's written, then yeah, dude, Pillsbury's on the hook for that.
And then if people who go out and do that point back to the Pillsbury Doughboy
and
as their source of morality.
Right, and they point to the cookie thing and say, well, here's what it says, then yeah, I think that where you should have gone from there has been like, cool, let's use your example. If it says on the instructions for, your biscuits that that you should do, that you should enslave people, or that you should, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, then yeah. But if he's using the Pillsbury Doughboy example, I think in the future, say, perfect, that's a great example.
Well,
let's apply that example. Let's take the biblical
this.
Verses and put them on there and see what happens.
Whenever a particular company takes a social stand, then typically there's the people who disagree with that stand, there's general outrage. Why? Because they think that stand is dangerous. An example of this is like the Hobby Lobby case or the Chick-fil-A case. Yeah. And you know how many people boycotted Chick-fil-A because of their stance on gay rights.
Yeah.
And so people would say, here's a company with all of this power and all of this influence and all this money, and they're making this stand against gay rights, and that's dangerous. That's harmful. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, yeah, you can have that.
The company is on the hook. His example was effective in that you let him apply poor standards to it. If you would have said, hey, let's take that example. I love that example. Let's apply it because you're still wrong. I
feel like my pushback on it was weak. Let's take a look at that. If you thought that he was telling you to go out and commit harm, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Pillsbury Doughboy is dangerous. Was that sort of
I wouldn't say the company caused it.
Yeah, the company caused it. But that's not really what we're asking. We're not asking, does Christianity, is this the correct interpretation of Christianity? Does correct Christianity cause this result? What we're asking is it dangerous? If you had the Pillsbury Doughboy releasing, confectionery goods, what have you, and you have hundreds of millions of people all seeing the Pillsbury Doughboy and having these hallucinations, pretty soon you'd start to ask some questions and be like, hey, what's going on? At that point, you wouldn't necessarily know what the link is, but would you at least start to admit that maybe there's a danger there?
Yeah. And I see where you were going, especially when you're in the moment. You're like, okay, I want to make sure that I'm bringing this back to the debate. And I could see you bringing it back. And so I can't fault that. What I just would say in the future is try and distill it down to what the most important thing you want to say is, and make sure you say that. I think
if I were to respond to it now, I would say, does the Pillsbury Doughboy have doctrines that people follow? Does it have commands?
No, don't. No, because you're putting that on him and you're letting him have the ability to change the topic and confuse it. Instead, say if the Pillsbury Doughboy, if Pillsbury put these things on their packaging,
then it would be dangerous.
Yeah. Period.
And because that's the thing, is like I tried to go with, here you have an example of a tremendous amount of harm that's being done by, Christians, and they're believing these things at scale. And I was like, if you had that level of harm and that extent and the numbers, then it's like, then there might be a problem. He's like, but it wouldn't be tied back to, you couldn't show that it was caused by this. It could be something else. And I'm like, that's where I should have instead gone with, if the Pillsbury Doughboy was leading to all of that and it had this written.
Yep. Then that company is on the hook. You're absolutely right. But again,
because the Bible has that, and that's the result.
And I think this is just an experience thing. I think the next time you go into a debate, if somebody brings something up, you're going to be like, okay, what is the most important thing that I need to respond to? And make sure that you give that most important thing. You can fluff it up and support it, but don't give the support before giving the core thesis. Make sure that you're making the core thesis central and then supporting it.
Well, because what he was trying to do is, I believe it's a reductio ad absurdum, where you take a particular idea, you run with it to the most absurd direction, and show how, like, if you take this all the way to this end, it's insane. And
it is, and there was one point that you beautifully responded. It was when you told him that this is a wonderful example of whataboutism. Can we see that clip? It was good. I was very proud of you. I was like, yes.
that was a tremendous exercise in whataboutism. It was, okay, well, if you're going to say that Christianity is dangerous, what about atheism? It can be dangerous too. Okay. If you want to have another debate called, is atheism dangerous?
So you're saying atheism can be dangerous?
I'm saying that there may be some things. That's not what's on trial today. There may be some dangers. I'm happy to have that discussion at another time. That's not what we're here to talk about. What we're here to talk about is Christianity dangerous? And when I present a very clear-cut case of how you have something that's rife for misinterpretation, and I show the link to the dangers that are caused, and you say, well, but then in that case, anything can be dangerous. What about atheism? I'm like, no. Like, you're missing the point.
Okay. So you were making that point, and I'm glad you called out the whataboutism. You were striking down on what was important. And as you were making the point, he jumped in and shifted you there. You were saying, hey, if you want to have a debate about whether or not hospitals are dangerous or atheism is dangerous, we can have that debate. And he goes, oh, so you're saying that it's dangerous. You didn't get to finish your point. He shifted you, and the point that you were making didn't land as heavy. And there was a worse one that happened just a little bit before that.
Well, no, it was that the point that I was trying to make, I think, was my strongest point, and it was tying the belief to the action. And that's where he threw me off with the whataboutism, and I could have roped him back in.
Yeah, but
and instead
you shifted with him, and you did it. It happened even worse just beforehand. Since we're on this topic, I know that we're bouncing around a little bit, but this is our review, and I really kind of want to point this out. This is probably going to be the hardest I'm going to be on you.
No, that's fine.
So let's watch the clip we're referencing.
Maybe this will help. You have a peer-reviewed meta-analysis saying that beliefs inform actions. Not only do beliefs inform actions, but you're more likely to act on a particular belief when it's firmly held, when it's regularly reinforced, when it's a core part of your identity, when it's everything that fits it, like the church fits this description like a hand in a glove.
That is a bomb. That is a, like, boom, there's the game. I've come with the evidence supporting exactly what I'm saying that you're asking for. Here it is. This needs a spotlight. This is this is a bomb to drop. What you need to do now is make sure that people understand that this is a bomb.
Yeah. Especially because earlier in the debate, when I asked him what it would take, he said, we need, to be able to link the beliefs to the actions that they have.
And here's the link. You have a huge study that we looked at together, and it's fantastic.
And he said in past debates, he's like, you need some type of a meta-analysis. And I was like, boom,
here's the
meta-analysis, respected journal, linking beliefs to actions, not just linking beliefs to actions, but beliefs that are like firmly held, or they're more likely to act on, that are regularly reinforced, they're more likely to act on. There's like a bunch of criteria.
And that criteria is perfectly fit.
Exactly the way that churches function.
Right. And so you're pulling out this bomb. What happens?
If beliefs inform actions all the time, then we can just go to, again, atheist historian Nathan Johnstone, when he talked about how a lot of times the Militant League of Atheists in the USSR used their commitment to an atheist worldview to justify the idea that they could go out and commit these atrocities. And again, the study I cited noted that when you lack a belief in God like that, it tends to move away from sort of good social behaviors we can see. By that logic, any sort of belief in atheism could, of course, result in sort of bad things, and we have to acknowledge there's a danger there.
So you dropped this bomb, and then what happened? Did people recognize that as a bomb? No, because you didn't give it room to breathe. You didn't give it the time or the credence necessary for people to understand that what you pulled out was really important. Because of that, it got blended in with less important things. In fact, because you brought up, other tangential things, it became just as important as those other tangential things. And I know that's not what you wanted. But because you were trying to bring it all together.
So I could have kept that bomb at the forefront and just kept saying things to kind of re-emphasize it and like keep hammering away at.
Yeah. And, really reinforcing, hey, here's what you asked for. You want the response? Here's the response. Boom. And then let that sit. And if he was to respond, because he did, he gave, whataboutist responses, then you bring him back and say, how does that relate to what I just told you?
Yeah. And it's like, you specifically asked for this standard. I met this standard. What more do you want? What will it take? Are you shifting the goalposts?
Well, not even that. Are you shifting the conversation so you don't have to respond to what I just brought out?
Yeah. That
is huge. That is huge. You've done so much research. And
that would have been so good if because I could have still, when he said, well, but anything can be dangerous. What about the, League of Militant Atheists in, the USSR and stuff. Then it's like, my response about whataboutism, it's like, yes, it's important to be like, you're like, well, what about this? What about that? What about these alternatives? It's like, we're not here to debate that, but I could have said that same response of a tremendous exercise in whataboutism. You're shifting the topic. It seems like you don't want to address this point.
Yep.
And held his feet to the fire. Because that's what he was doing, was he was shifting. And he started to squirm, and he's like, well, then that guy's anything, Ken. And he started
and
trying to shine the spotlight elsewhere.
And he went with it. But I think in future debates, if somebody shifts, see if the conversation is shifting because
they're uncomfortable,
or if it's time for the conversation to logically progress. But if you're still making a point and someone cuts you off and shifts the conversation, all you got to do is say, hold on, the conversation is shifting. I want to finish this point.
Yeah.
And that's understandable, respectable, and something that is a tool that should be in your arsenal.
Yeah. Without making it seem like I'm shying away from a point he's making.
No, we'll address that after.
I'm happy to talk about that still, but it feels like you're shifting away from this important thing.
Yeah. Please respond to what I just said.
Yeah. Oof.
I know. You had done a lot of amazing research. And what people don't realize is there's a lot of theater that goes into a debate. Your presentation, your timing, giving a pregnant pause, giving a statement room to breathe so that people can zero in on it and recognize what is important about it. And if
I was rushing to get as many points in as possible.
And then the important stuff gets lost in the noise.
Yeah. Oof.
Again, it's a first debate, but yeah.
Yeah. I think maybe next time I'll have like an outline of here's my meat, here's my 3 main points, and then everything else just points to those and just like keep.
You got it. Okay, there was another clip that I want to look at next. And he'd said it several times in the debate, but it was about mental health. And, you know, you haven't discounted mental health, and so you can't look at the beliefs as the cause when you haven't ruled out mental health. Which implies that anyone who does something dangerous in the name of religion and says they did it in the name of religion is ill, has mental health issues. You know, their neurodivergence is the cause of their violence, which is horrendous. And dude, you called it out, and I both cheered and yelled at the TV when this happened, because you did really, really well. And then you let's just watch the clip.
Well, we would say their mental health is what is dangerous. They're using something to justify. We need to clarify here between mental health and the person's own motivators versus what they use to justify it.
But
motivators
see,
are what are actually causing the actions there.
I'm not willing to say that religion is a mental illness, and I feel like you're teetering on the edge there of saying, okay, here's people who in mass, you know, hundreds of millions are coming to this conclusion. Well, it's just their mental health.
Well, how do you know it's hundreds of
their
millions?
mental health. They're just mentally ill. It's like, no, I have more respect for Christians than that.
Well, first of all, I'm not saying you're making that argument. And you keep saying hundreds of millions. I mean, is there any research that shows hundreds of millions are taking verses from the Bible to use them to do horrible things?
Stop. I'm not willing to say that mental health, you know, or neurodivergence is the cause of violent behavior, right? That was beautiful. That was very well said, and it was calling out something really important. And I think bravo on that. How do you think that went?
I think I have mixed feelings on it.
Why?
On the one hand, I don't think that everyone who is religious is mentally ill. And there's some people who will be like, oh, religious people, they're just mentally ill. I wouldn't go there. I think that by calling him out for making that connection, because that's absolutely what he was doing. So when he said, well, I'm not saying that, it's like,
no, he didn't say that. That's the problem that I got really frustrated with you at. And it happened in the moment, and it kills me.
You're saying he wasn't making that point.
No, what he did is he made the point, you called him out on it, and he said, I'm not accusing you of making that point. Nah, dude, you're the one who made the point, not me. If you would have,
what he said?
Yes.
First of all, I'm not saying you're making that argument.
Oh my God.
So you just went through and called him out for blaming neurodivergence on violent behavior, so that.
And he said, I'm not saying you're making that point. It's like,
and you know what? Right after that, everyone, you know, or at least a significant amount of the audience went, wow, okay, so was Thomas? I thought that was something that IP was saying, but I guess Thomas was making that bad point.
jeez.
I'm not saying like, you're making
in
that.
the moment.
I know.
What I heard and what he said were two different things. What I heard was him saying, I'm not making that point. Because he so quickly and rapidly moved on to, you know, well, what about this? And you like change the topic again.
And it's easy to go in, but if you say,
there's two things. Is one, even if he had said, I'm not making that point, I should have nailed it down and said, what point are you making?
Yes.
Because it sounds a lot like that's the point that you're making. Is that these people who are committing these violent acts that are saying they're doing it because of their religion, that it's because of their mental health. And so all of these hundreds of millions of Christians who believe in this horrible, horrific thing, they're all just mentally ill.
Or you know, have you ruled out that that mental illness? Because it seems like mental illness is what's dangerous.
After
he's literally said, that is literally the words out of his mouth. And
so it's which sounds tremendously ableistic too, because it's like, you know, there's no. If you're going to make that claim, then it's like, oh, hey, all the people with autism are just these horrible, violent people. It's like, bro, like, come on.
And yet, when you called him out on it, it was perfect. And then you said, I'm not accusing you of that. No.
It's like, no, that's not the statement that you're.
Yeah. And I think that if you would have made him sit in it for at least a minute, it would have really rung home, because you prepared well, you studied well, you brought good information, and it's just the practice of it. It's just the practice of going, hold on, this is important. Let's focus on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you see, like, I cheered when you were just like, I'm not willing to grant that, I'm not willing to say that of religious people. I have more respect for religious people. Beautifully said.
And I was saying I have more respect than you do.
And then
he said, oh, no, saying you're saying that.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yeah.
No, I'm saying you're saying that.
Yeah. Wow. I know. Okay, so wrapping back around, we went through things like, your presentation and about which things really needed to shine through. I kind of want to go back really quickly to intrinsic versus extrinsic religiosity, because I know we already talked about it, but toward the end there, you got the trail and you were going to drop something really important that we had practiced, and you ran out of time.
I know. And it was frustrating because then one of the questioners called me out for it.
Yeah. And so can we just watch that together for a second and maybe let people know what you were going to say, why it was important, and maybe why that should have been front loaded earlier in the debate?
If intrinsic religiosity was harmful and dangerous.
Well, what do you mean by intrinsic religiosity?
Intrinsic Christian religiosity specifically. Christians, it would be intrinsic motivators. So let me
wait, before you, because I don't want to get lost in terminology. So when you say intrinsic Christianity,
intrinsic religiosity from Christian backgrounds.
Can you give a definition of intrinsic religiosity?
I did in the earlier slide here. I can put it back up. So intrinsic religiosity is when persons are disposed to use persons find their master motive in religion, having embraced the creed of individual endeavors, to internalize it and follow it fully. And that subject is a Christian, they'd be an intrinsic religious Christian. So,
but is love your neighbor intrinsically Christian?
Love thy neighbor is a command, and when someone is intrinsically religious, they draw from those kind of commands as their motivators. That's
not
the point.
Not necessarily.
Well, hold on. That's the point we have to get to.
And guys.
Okay, so we talked about the history of intrinsic religiosity versus extrinsic religiosity, and the point of that is that it was specifically trying to strike a difference between the people who go that really, really just accept it and bring it into their hearts, and the people who are going for external reasons. And that is a response to, separate out. And honestly, if you want to go with that, that's fine. But it is poll data. You need to understand that there's limitations to it.
The other thing too, and this is a little bit off where you're going, but the ROS scale, that's a false dichotomy, because what they found was that there's not just intrinsic and extrinsic, but there's like several other different things.
The questing is one of them.
And it's kind of a spectrum too.
Yeah.
Like you can fall anywhere on that thing.
Absolutely.
So
and so you're absolutely right. The ROS scale is the poll that is used, and other studies have shown that you can get even more information as you provide more categories for people to fall into. But this specifically is referencing this religiosity in a way that it is not being tested for, it is not being used, and it is not being studied in those journals, right? Christian religiosity, Christian belief is not a part of that. It's, do you go because your family goes, or do you go because you've internalized the teachings? That is what that is. To say, anything about what the commandments are, what the specific tenets are, that doesn't go into it. And so he was starting to conflate the two, and you called him on it, and you said, can you please describe what you're talking about?
Yeah, and it's like towards the end, right at the very end, I said, is love your neighbor intrinsically Christian? And he said, love thy neighbor is a command. And he's like, and people who are intrinsically Christian follow those kinds of commands. And I said not necessarily, and I ran out of time. But the thing is, it's like, love thy neighbor is a command, but stone gay people is also a command. And so it's like, if you're saying, oh, if you're intrinsically Christian, if your motivations are because you really want to do what the Bible says for internal reasons, you're going to follow the commands of the Bible, then it's like you can't cherry pick out the commands. Because intrinsic doesn't mean, commands aren't intrinsically Christian. They could be, a part of the Bible. They could be in the Bible. You could say certain things maybe are inherently Christian. But even then, inherent has multiple definitions.
And it's something that he used to prior debates that you were ready to go for, but didn't come up. But yeah.
Well, and an example too is like he would switch the definitions in and out between the two in past debates. And so if he says that something's intrinsically Christian or inherently Christian, and he switches it in and out to make a point, it's kind of like making a syllogism where like the logic might be okay, but the premises are switching definitions. So an example of that would be like saying, all wedding rings are bands, all bands play music, therefore all wedding rings play music. It's like you've used two different definitions of band, and so because they're homonyms or whatever, or not homonyms, but then you're ending up with a conclusion that doesn't follow.
Correct. And when you're bringing up all of this data about intrinsic religiosity, and then you start talking about intrinsic Christianity, it is no wonder that an audience would conflate the two.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the argument being made relies on conflating those two. When in fact, if you're specifically talking about Christian tenets, if you're specifically talking about religious teachings, in the Christian faith, you have stopped when it comes to what the data he provided was.
Yeah, the motive has nothing to do with it. If you're saying this particular teaching, it's found in the Bible, it's believed by Christians, the majority of Christians, and they interpret it this way, then it's like, that has nothing to do with why they follow it. And so he's trying to look at why people follow things. It's like, well, if people are authentic about their beliefs, then they're like less likely to have mental health issues.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, and he made that point in the debate where he's talking about how like, oh, they have better mental health. And at the very end of my closing statement, I had something written up that I didn't have time to get to. And it was basically that I had in part of my introductory statement I didn't have time for, I had two different studies that showed that increased levels of shunning leads to increased hostility towards the outgroup. So for example, if you're a part of a church that says, we should shun non-believers or kick them out, like with Jehovah's Witnesses,
Sure.
or with the church saying, having all these verses denigrating gay people and shunning them and kicking them out of the community, or saying, believers and non-believers shouldn't be equally yoked. You shouldn't marry a non-believer or whatever. And it's like you have these verses that are shunning them, and it leads to overall increased tribalism towards them. And the other study was showing how ostracism leads to increased depression. And so people who are ostracized, who are shunned, who are kicked out, they start to develop worse mental health. So for him to say, when Christians who are in the majority, your boss, your coworkers, your family members, all your friends, they're all religious and they're all Christian, and then you leave the faith and there's shunning and there's ostracism, of course you're going to have worse depression and mental health. Because you're in a situation where everyone is kicking you out of the group and the circle, and you don't feel comfortable, you don't feel safe, you don't feel welcome, you don't feel wanted, you feel like no one, your parents aren't proud of you, you feel like nobody wants to date you or hang out with you. And so it's like, of course you're going to have increased anxiety, not to mention religious trauma syndrome once all of these fears that you've been equipped with, while religious people are told that like religion makes you so happy, it's so wonderful, you're going to heaven, everything is going to be great. And so it's like, yeah, you might have blissful ignorance, and it's like, it might feel great, but to quote Banachek, you can give drugs to a junkie and it'll make them feel good. It doesn't mean it's good for them. And so it's like, you have all of these people who are not religious, who are suffering from the effects of the harm, an example of harm that religion is doing to them. And he's pointing to 5 or 6 of his studies all had to do with mental health, depression, anxiety, suicide rates. And it's like, why do you think it's worse? It's because of the harm that the religion is doing. And that's like, I really wanted to hammer that home and be like, why do you think? And then it's because then when all of that happens, then the non-religious people come and say, hey, look, this is hurting us. This is the harm that's being done, and we're gaslit and told that religion doesn't cause harm by people in debates like this.
Yeah.
And so it's like that would have been like if I had really landed that at the end of my closing statement, but everything was happening so fast, and I'd written down a thing about that, and then just, I don't know, man. Like
honestly, it's practice, and I think if we wanted to summarize a little bit, what key things do you take away from this? Because I'd really love to know, and I'd love to kind of help in the future, because you did great. You prepared so much. It's just the act of doing it. What did you take away from it?
I mean, my takeaway would be, one, have a better structured introductory statement. Practice it time-wise and really get it down, and have like a main point and a method of showing it that I just keep coming back to and emphasizing.
You got it.
And then keep coming back to that throughout the debate. So have like a main overall point, and then when he tries to deviate from it, keep bringing it back. And when I slam something down, emphasize it. Take time, let it sit for a minute, and when he tries to deviate from it, rub his nose in it a little bit.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with following him if he wants to deviate, but just make sure that it doesn't come at the cost of the point you're making. Because there are times when you start to deviate from what he's talking about, and he says, no, I want to finish this first. And he gets to finish his point. You have that right as well.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the other thing is just work through the technical hiccups. Maybe print out my opening statement rather than have it on a tablet.
Honestly, dude, even the best debates I've seen, most of them have some kind of technical issue. Don't internalize the technical issues part. I think that an audience member watching that wouldn't sit there and be like, oh, Thomas Westbrook really screwed up on the whole tablet thing. Like, they're there for the content of your debate. So don't be so hard on yourself. Also,
I think that when I'm not technically prepared, it leads to long pauses, uhs, gaps, filler words, which takes up more time. And it also seems like I'm less confident and less prepared in my content.
Yes and no. A gap in speaking does not mean you're less prepared. I'm taking my time to emphasize this right now. It doesn't look like I'm dumb. It doesn't look like I'm not prepared. The ums and ahs, you got to work on. But giving something room to breathe is good. And if you're trying to eliminate those, everything's going to get lost in the static again. Yeah. I know it's so much different than doing a YouTube video, because on a YouTube video, you edit out all of that extra space. You want to cram content into as clear and educational and entertaining a thing as you can on Holy Kool-Aid, and I'm damn proud that I get to help and edit those videos. But that said, people can stop, they can pause, rewind, go back.
Or watch on double speed if they're getting bored.
Right. And they can pull up that transcript, once YouTube kind of goes through and puts that transcript out there. That's not the case for a debate. This is a different format. And because of that, you need to not apply the same rules to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's parts, even when I was releasing the debate to my channel, where I'm so used to editing out pauses and gaps and long things and stuff. And if I'm doing that in a debate, even if I kept all of the content and I just took out some ums, or I just took out a few things, it's kind of dishonest, because you're trying to polish it up and make yourself look better than you are. And two, you're going to be accused of, oh, what did he cut out there? What did he omit? And especially if you cut out something that your opponent said. Oh, yeah. So like with the debate, I released the entire thing like uncut. The only part, there was like one part where the audience members came in front for Q&A of the camera. And so the moderator said, hey, can you move the camera over to the side? So I got up and moved the camera. But it's like that, there was no content, there was no questions, there was nothing that was debate related. And I cut that out kind of seamlessly. But aside from that, it was like I wanted to be as honest as possible with just showing the content. And that's such a weird feeling for me, because like with my videos, I'm like, hey, here's an idea. I can cut as much as I want because I'm completely in control of the end result. They know that it's still my words that are handcrafted a particular way, even if I cut out a breath or if I cut out a pause or something and do a jump cut.
And
So-
he does. He cuts out the breaths, ladies and gentlemen. Go back and watch your Holy Koolaid videos. He cuts the breaths out. Or because I do this with him.
Because I don't want to waste anyone's time.
Because breathing wastes people's time. Let's let that sit in. I'm doing a pregnant pause. It doesn't mean I'm unprepared. I know. Okay, sorry.
On that note, any final words that you want to add?
Yeah. Your first debate was good. You were well prepared. You were enthusiastic. You were excited, and it was visible. And so was your opponent. Your opponent had some really, really great moves. He really did. We brought up a lot of things, but like he shifted things to move the conversation. He was bringing things back to his point. You know, I think that overall the debate went really, really well. And I would not have watched that and been like, oh, that's Holy Koolaid's first debate. So I think as far as that's concerned, it's a win. And I'm really excited to see you move forward in this. Now that I've seen you debate, I want to be a part of your team. I want to see you do more. And I want to help you in any way that I can. And so let's do this, man. Thank you for including me.
It's definitely it's a lot of stress. I'm on the fence as to whether I want to keep doing debates or not. It's a new format, but we'll see. But either way, thank you for helping me prepare, and thank you for going over this. And guys, if you want to find Eric's work, he has a channel called Skeptic Generation, and I'll put links to all of his stuff below.
Thank you, man.
And he also helps me edit videos.
Yes, I do.
As always, thank you guys for watching. Dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.